Hey guys, Dr. Dex here. Today I'm going to talk to you about building in different climates, sometimes extreme, sometimes just variable climates, and what we do to kind of get us through some of those difficult times on the job site. So if you like this video, don't forget to click that subscribe button. It's summer-like conditions here in Washington State right now, and it has been for weeks. We're not used to having such warm days or windy. It's quite windy as well. So that's kind of what sparked this concept for this video was what are we doing when we're dealing with 80 plus degree days where materials are going to warm up. And the type of materials we use, mostly PVC and composites, they like to expand and contract in the heat. The most important thing that I can give you as far as advice for all you new deck builders, or maybe you're build with wood a lot and you don't build with a lot of PVC and you're going to be starting that new PVC project or new composite deck, is you got to take into consideration for expansion and contraction. And so expansion and contraction, boards are going to warm up. As they sit in the sun all day, they're going to expand, and then at night they're going to cool back down. So they move a lot back and forth just in a pile. Once you pin them down, that's going to minimize your expansion and contraction. But if you're not aware, let's just say you grab a hot board and you install it on an 80 or 90 degree day, and you butt everything together nice and tight. Let's use fascia for example, because this has happened to me in the past, and it's kind of a bummer if you're not aware of it. Or let's say you laid your entire deck down and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon and it's 100 degrees. All those boards are hot and they're going to be expanded. I usually wait till the next day to cut everything down, because if you cut those boards when they're completely hot and expanded, you cut your lines, you fit everything perfect, you go home for the night, you come back in the morning, everything's going to shrink, and your gaps are going to be, from a standard gap, they're going to be too big. And they're always going to be that way. And they're even going to be a little bit worse in the winter time because it's even colder than the average temperature was when you installed the decking. So when I'm working in the summertime, I leave less gap on just about everything I build. And then I try to cut as much as possible in the morning. First thing in the morning, I'll make all my cuts. That way I know that the board might grow, but it's not going to shrink any more than it already has. Another tip would be to try to keep your materials out of the sun as much as possible. You can tarp them up, put some lumber on them, and you can also wet them down before cutting if you really have a super hot day and things aren't working so well for you, and you know that board's still really warm. Run a hose on it for a minute and try to get that board cooled down before you make your cuts. If you have to absolutely cut in the middle of the day in the heat, it's going to save you some issues. The one thing I will not do is install fascia boards when it's really hot out, because when I do, if you butt things tight and everything's hot, in the morning you look up and you're going to have, up to a 1/4 inch gap, which in the afternoon it'll be tight again, and that's great. But then when it's cold in the morning, you're just going to have gaps everywhere. So I try to minimize that as much as possible by trying to keep the boards cool, trying to cut everything I can in the morning, and try not to install too much of it in the heat of the day. I'll perform other tasks as much as possible until I get to that opportune day, or maybe it's cloudy in the morning or in the afternoon. Whenever it's cloudy, and the sun's not beating down on those boards, then we'll start cutting them in and making it happen. But if all else fails, tarp them up and keep them wet, or put them in the shade as much as you can, just to make sure that they stay cool. All right, let's just say you're trying to build a deck and it's really windy out and it's a second story project. I would suggest trying to brace as much of your post locations as possible. The last thing you want is when you're trying to put up a beam in the wind and things are blowing around and your posts aren't staying stable. So lock that baby down. Make sure that it stays stable. If you're building a deck and you're framing it and there's that much wind, well, maybe you consider not working in the wind. But if it's a really windy area or a time of day where you have to keep working, just make sure you brace things up. You can see right now this tent that we have is moving around quite a bit. Make sure that baby's anchored down. But as far as the deck goes, I do a lot of V-bracing, okay? V-bracing helps things from wiggle and wobble, and it helps keep things from moving around too much in the wind, and also while you're crawling around on the deck. So even if it's temporary until you get things locked down, V-bracing is a great way to keep something from moving too much on you. And basically you're just putting 2-bys on the bottom of your deck or Frenching them in, depending if you have soffitting or whatever going on, and bracing on a 45-degree angle in 2 directions to keep the shift and the wobble from going back and forth on the deck. Okay, so it doesn't snow a lot here in Washington, but it does get cold enough to ice up. So we've had issues before where all of our lumber is completely frozen together because it rained overnight, but then it got so cold that everything froze. And that is a really tough thing to deal with. The one thing I've done in the past is I've taken a weed burner, hooked it up to a bottle of propane, and actually thawed everything out with a weed burner and made things decent enough so we could actually install it. Because the last thing you want to do is install a joist on top of a beam that has ice, because you're not going to get a flat connection. And then when it thaws out, you're going to have a gap between your beam and your joist for that connection. So you got to make sure that it's all cleaned up. I've seen guys scrape. I've seen them take shovels. I've seen people take hammers and try to bang all the ice off. But what I found works the best for me was a weed burner. But if you put too much heat on something, you're actually going to burn the wood. So be careful on how much fire you put on that lumber, or how close you get to it. It's not the safest thing in the world, but it is effective on doing what I needed to do, and that's a thaw out or de-ice materials. And my all-time favorite, it rains a lot here in Washington State, and we get our fair share of annual rain. A couple things you need to consider when you're working in the rain is if you want to use protective membrane tape. We try to work around rain squalls and all that kind of stuff. Membrane tape really doesn't stick to wet lumber too well. So consider either using that weed burner again to dry out in between rain squalls, or possibly try to lay out your tape on a dry day versus a wet day. If you absolutely have to lay your tape and get it down while it's raining, we use a hammer tacker, and we just tack it down every 2 feet or so, and then we're just trying to be really careful. Once you remove the moisture, that tape will eventually stick. And so that's one option that we've used when we absolutely have to tape when it's coming down. Another thing is, let's say you're doing a lot of end grain cuts and you have to put on a lot of end grain solution in the rain. We often use a cover like an Easy Up or a tent like this to keep an area dry. So once you cut a board, even if it's soaking wet, usually the end grain will have enough dryness to it to be able to absorb some product into the end grains. So we usually try to cut under a dry space. We'll create one by using a lot of these different tents and covers and things like that, or try to find a dry area under an eave or an overhang on the house where we can continue working, where it's not just getting continually soaked. Because if you try to paint an end grain that is already saturated with water, it's not going to absorb very well. So you're not really being effective with the product. So I've even gone as far as recutting a board because it was wet on the end and I wanted to get a good soaking of end grain solution in it. So I'll make the cut, apply it, and then go about my business. There you go, guys. That's a few tips on what to do while you're building in those extreme conditions. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when we're putting out new content. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a great day.